Eco-suicide is in full action in front of our eyes, and only we as a society can stop this and rebuild our beautiful city of Durban and KZN in the KZN province in South Africa. This metro needs anywhere between 10 billion to 20 billion to reinstate its water and sewage infrastructure that's been neglected for almost 3 decades. So how are we going to fix this? Stay tuned, and our host today is going to be Benoit Leroy. Stay with us for more.
Good afternoon, viewers, and welcome to our guests to what I think is going to be an explosive 2023. It has started off with a bang and a few duds, and we'll talk about the two of them. The water chamber was established about 4 years ago to try and overcome these issues that we have, so that we can coalesce and aggregate the private sector into supporting, collaborating, funding and getting the mess sorted out in our water security issues. And really what we're seeing now is we really have to do it in the water energy nexus, because the two are interlinked, to avoid this eco-suicide. And I use the words advisedly. I'm talking, we're a bunch of lemmings heading for ecological suicide. And I'm not using the words, very lightly. Our guests are Professor Anthony Turton, also colleague and founder, as is Fred Platt of the Water Chamber. We have apologies from Hamant Kassan today, who is battling load shedding, as many of us are. The session is being recorded, so will be available on various social media, from Amazon through to Facebook, LinkedIn, and the like, so that people can catch up. It's a rather depressing time, but we'll try and make this as entertaining, factual, and as jovial as possible. Tony's just come out of 24 hours of load shedding and water shedding for the last couple of years. So, not everybody's in a happy space, but I think, let's not let this crisis go to waste, and soon we'll be using catastrophe. So, but crisis is a quicker word to use, so that we can, I think the biggest issue we have is that we have a complacent society. Since 94, we seem to have lost our desire to rebuild our country. And what's happened is our active citizenry has really been left to very few. It's really not enough. Trying to understand the problems that we have will help us in getting the challenges sorted out. And we're really wanting to try and bridge the divide between the public and private sector. That's been done a lot of harm, not only since 94, but also since COVID, because our trust in government worldwide has actually been severely impacted. And yes, we must use social media responsibly and not against each other, which has been one of the latest trends. So this show we only deal with facts. If you don't have them, please abstain. We don't need your input. Most people prefer to deal with facts. It's an emotive time, but the reality is this country was built out of nothing. We're getting close to most things being dysfunctional, so we can rebuild it. There's a platform to rebuild it, but we have to acknowledge where we're at. So without further ado, Tony is the only one of us. I was brought up in KZN, and I'm not going back. Tony's convinced me I'm not. unfortunately. I turned down conferences last year also. I just cannot afford to be caught in the issues there. And I have a very, very, let's say, distinctive nose for sewage. I can pick it up quite a long way, having worked in this poo for quite a long time. Tony, you're based in the South Coast. You're having the brunt of it in probably the most dysfunctional, apart from eThekwini, the most dysfunctional region, Ugu, from a water perspective for a long time, with the water mafia and the likes, and it's been disrupted, quite heavily. And now with the load shedding and all the likes. So from your perspective, what is your stock take, and where should we start the conversation? And using the terminology which has got record hits on LinkedIn of eco-suicide, because we're killing our environment. That means we're killing ourselves.
Yes, good afternoon to you and the listeners. I'm a trained observer, so I sit here in a privileged position and I watch things happening around me. And what I see is quite alarming. So I would like to start off by saying that I have come up with my own definition of state failure. And let's first start off with that definition, because I think that is intrinsic to what we are talking about today. So I refer to state failure as that moment in time when a unit of government is unable to interpret signals coming from its operational environment and then use those signals to convert it basically into an action plan or a remediation strategy that is adequately resourced and viable. In other words, it's about an entity of government, because government's not monolithic. There's the government, but then there are government departments, and then there are province, and then there's municipalities, and then departments in municipalities. So it's not monolithic by any stretch of imagination. So when a unit of government is unable to interpret signals from the operational environment and then turn that input into the management into an output that is viable, then we are faced with state failure at the local level. Now, let me give you an example that made the news in December last year. There was this big hoo-ha in the media about should the beaches in Durban be opened, yes or no, and are they safe? And the mayor took a dip in the, et cetera, et cetera. And then people started getting all excited about the fact that on the waterfront, there are a number of public swimming pools that are all dysfunctional. And like about 2 or 3 days before the start of the annual holiday, a communication was put out that, they are actually busy getting a quotation now to fix these features. Now, that tells us that there's absolutely no capacity to understand the severity of the problem. There's absolutely no capacity. In other words, the signal coming from the operational environment for the eThekwini management team was, listen, tourism is a big part of our national revenue, our annual revenue take, and unless we get this tourism thing right, people aren't going to come and the economy is going to crash. So they were completely unable to do that. In fact, they did not even show the cognitive ability to grasp why such a question was even important. So, in other words, there are many examples like that, but that's just probably the most pressing example that I can give you. There are other examples, where we start seeing, for example, the Minister of Minerals, Greg Matash, who constantly makes these pronouncements, absolute sweeping pronouncements about how Eskom is going to be fixed up. Just fire this person, fire that person, and it'll all get fixed up tomorrow, without any real insight into what it means, into how electricity is actually generated, and what it means to have a long-term maintenance plan, and what the significance is of grid stability, etc. So we see this definition of mine playing out at multiple levels, to the point where we now have many local municipalities that are completely dysfunctional. Now, when I say completely dysfunctional, they are unable to convert the inputs from the operational environment into outputs. For example, potholes. They're unable to say, well, the trend in potholes is getting worse, therefore we must do something about potholes. They're just unable to do that. But what they do now is they start converting all of the cash coming in to the municipality. They convert that into salaries and perks and benefits for the employees. So once again, there's no ability to turn an input into an output. And now it gets very interesting, because your labor legislation kicks in, And your labor legislation gives these people rights and privileges without giving them any responsibilities. So you cannot get rid of them. You cannot suspend them. And in fact, many of these municipalities end up with a big bun fight over suspension of people, which were then reinstated. Or in the case of Ugu, where there is actually empirical evidence that some of the unionized workers, when they are disciplined, they actually go out and target pieces of infrastructure and destroy it. So these are municipal workers with a knowledge of how the system functions. They deliberately go and demolish but critical parts of the infrastructure as a labor action, and there's no consequences whatsoever. So the bottom line is that KZN, in my humble opinion, is becoming more and more unstable. It's becoming more and more incapable of actually dealing with the crisis. We're still dealing with the floods from last year. We're still dealing with the rioting from 18 months ago, and we still never really catch a wake up and start dealing with what we're dealing with today. And it's not uncommon in KZN, for example, when you drive around on some of the district roads, that you see large portions of road washed away from the previous flooding, or even the flooding before that have had some kind of barrier put up around it, and that barrier becomes a permanent feature, and the road is never repaired. So, in other words, we are not making progress. And what we're starting to see now is we are seeing ordinary citizens that are coming together and saying, no, enough is enough. The anger is rising. But we're also starting to see organization taking place at the local level. So we've got a thing in Margate called Tidy Towns, for example, which is a very, very effective little citizen-driven initiative where they are doing what the municipalities should be doing. And we are seeing this now replicated all over KZN. Whether this is enough is an open question. Whether this is legal in terms of the strict letter of the law is a complete open question. But whether the law is even relevant at the moment, given the fact that we sometimes have looting of trucks in front of the police are actually standing there when the trucks are being looted, and the police are not protecting the truck. In fact, if anything, looks like they're protecting the looters. So this starts to pose the question: is the law in fact relevant here in this part of the world? And on this very same show, we had a long conversation previously about Section 21 of the National Water Act, about the impeding the bed bank and flow, or altering the bed bank and flow of a river for illegal sand mining. We had a promise that Water Affairs would do something about it. To this day, absolutely nothing has happened. That activity carries on with absolute impunity. So it's not far-fetched to accept that we are in fact a lawless society here. There is no real law, and in fact, just in the last 2 weeks, I've been made aware of vigilante action, or quite violent vigilante action, where local people have taken the matter into their own hand. One was against a young woman who was trying to steal money at an ATM, and she was taken over by the local mob, and they beat her. They literally beat her to death, all captured on cell phone camera. And there was also some cattle theft that happened just a short while ago in the northern part of KZN, where the two young men were captured, hung by their feet, upside down, naked, and then beaten to within an inch of their life with a whip and with mopkiris. So in other words, we're seeing this kind of vigilante justice playing out now in the absence of proper law and order. So the question that I pose now is the law actually relevant here anymore? Because it's not being applied. And therefore, if that's the case, if we're living in a state of lawlessness, where what I've illustrated now is the inability of the local authority to interpret signals coming from its operational environment and translate that into an actionable set of strategies and policy reforms, then we are in a failing state scenario, or in fact we probably are already a failed state scenario. Whether we are failing or have already failed, that's an academic question. But we are certainly deeply advanced down that road. So that's where we are today. This is the canary in the down the mine shaft, and this I'm afraid gives us an indication of what is likely to happen in other parts of the country as this state failure continues. Back to you.
Thanks for that initial comment, Tony. I believe in governance, and government is there to govern and nothing else. Not to run business, it can't. Nowhere in the world does government run business successfully. Business is a separate definition in our language, in all our languages. And when it interferes, it breaks. But if you just look at 97% of our sewage works do not comply to a very, very standard, average compliance standard. 97 did not, and the minister actually said it's actually 99, 100%. In other words, everything has failed. He's wrong. The Western Cape hasn't failed. They had most of the successes. But if you just look at that was done 2 years ago. It was published last year, but it was done the year before. So 2021 took a year to gather the data. I mean, we in the first industrial revolution, yeah, took a year to gather the data, do the audits and the like. Published it in 2022 and react a bit later. You know, I mean, the canary had died from methane poisoning already. But, you know, 97% of our sewage plants do not comply, and we have done nothing about it. In actual fact, it's gotten worse, okay? And wait till you see the non-revenue water numbers, okay? They've also gotten worse. They're yet to be published, but we expect that, okay? So we're not that done as citizens. We understand that we're deteriorating. I personally believe we are a failed state. You get different levels of failing, and we all struggle at different levels. But I do believe that we can arrest it, because I will go down fighting, okay? And fighting means getting our infrastructure correct. But now here's the other canary. Water energy nexus. You cannot purify water, you can't move water, you can't supply water, you can't convey sewage out of cities without energy. So Fred, are we being hit by a double whammy where the energy will in actual fact force the water wars? Because I see Tony, I'm sure he'll be back, because you know, I'm using the pun here, but the lack of energy is going to push the water you know, outside of our reach. What do you think of this, specifically where in KZN, where I mean, they've got the three whammies. We've all got load shedding, they've got destroyed infrastructure that hasn't been maintained for 30 years, but also, okay, this ongoing load shedding just adds to the whole quandary, because the manufacturing industry, you know, in Richards Bay and in Prospecton in the southern basin of eThekwini are really, with tourism, the hearts of the economy in the greater eThekwini area. What is your take on that, Fred?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. You know, the reality of the matter is that energy and water and the nexus of energy and water and waste obviously is where it all comes together. And I think when we opened up the discussion today, there was a slogan that said, is water the bigger crisis than energy? And the reality of the matter is that the one feeds the other, and at the end of the day, they will drive it into a disaster. The impact of energy is, or the lack of energy, obviously is huge in terms of business and the ability of business to respond competitively at the end of the day. But it also impacts on the ability to evacuate sewage, to pump water, as you mentioned, to communities, etc. So the problem becomes bigger. Now, just to go back to what Tony was speaking about, and just listening to him, and just trying to digest what he was saying. The reality of any society is that the glue of society that keeps everyone together and that keeps people adhering and wanting to adhere to the law is hope. And that hope is an indication that things are getting better, that there is a plan in place, that there is a response that is happening, and people generally are very patient. I think within the South African environment, business communities, as you mentioned, since 1994 have been way too patient, way too understanding, way too accommodating. And so we didn't see an engaged civil society. So what we're sitting with at the moment is we're sitting with two major problems, in my opinion. The one is the infrastructure where it is, and it is broken, and it is there, and it is dysfunctional, etc., etc. And we know that. Now, that's a given. You you can't wish it away, and there's a path to rehabilitation, and there's funding to rehabilitation, and there's a plan to rehabilitation, etc. But it is what it is. The bigger problem for me is not the fact that we are where we are, but it's what Tony was speaking about, in that the signals are not coming through and that the plans are not being actioned to turn this around. Because if they are, then we start rebuilding hope. Because hope is built effectively out of trust. And there's a whole lot of issues around governance, as you mentioned, around trust that need to be addressed. And the other one is a plan. There's got to be a plan. So people have got to see, this is where we're going, this is what's happening. And the third one is, it doesn't help to have a plan if you don't start seeing action. So at the end of the day, the point is that we are where we are in a long-winded way. We've got a dysfunctional, infrastructure. We have a populace that's losing hope and faith in the ability of government to turn it around, and we have business that is not engaging to the degree that it should, but in fact potentially disengaging, which is a bigger problem for us, and actually leaving the platform and saying, look, we've just had enough and we're going. So for me, how do we turn that around? More so, and I think we spend an enormous amount of time on what is physically needed to turn this around, what is the engineering plan, what is the whatever, but there's a bigger issue here. And that is, how do we ensure that the correct information is available on which firm decisions can be taken so that a plan can be put in place so that we can engage the stakeholders, give them hope, we can engage business and get them to open their wallets so that we can turn the situation around. We're either on the high road, which involves that, or we're on the road which has just been painted here, which says unless there's that action, unless there's that coalescence of all of those issues into one plan, the inevitable consequence is one of a degradation and a failed state.
Thanks, Fred. You know, it just reminded me of the water sanitation master plan. We were quite proud of ourselves because we managed to put pressure through the chamber and other organizations and the PPGI in 2018 to have the then minister, who's ironically Minister of Tourism now, have a team publish the water sanitation master plan. But I'm really not proud that we have done zip on it. Since then, we had the National Water Security Framework at NDP, National Development Plan level, and we were all gung-ho and we thought things are really starting to happen now. All the best brains around the table, and including government and academia and big business. Nothing's happened. We've had NIP 2050, phase 1 and phase 2, and water was included as one of the 5 top priorities. Nothing. 2013, Eskom, 2000 to 2002, Eskom asked for something like 25 to 35 gigawatts extra, of which 20 gigawatt generation capacity was to replace what was planned to be closed this decade. And at the end of the decade, but it's closing, we've got half the fleet closed purely because we didn't look after it and we redlined it. So now that's 20 years ago. So going on 21 years. Is to me, I ask myself the question, despite everything we've tried to do, is the master plan in 20 years' time going to still be a plan? So the question is, what do we look? We have to put in hope. And I think all of us have got a trickle. I've got a last drop of hope. You guys might have a little bit more, not sure. I've got a last drop of hope, but I'm not sleepy at night because of the load shedding. So I try and get an hour during the day. And that's actually worth probably 10 at night. But everybody's in a similar situation, so it's no use bleating about it. But the reality is, how do we get that hope back in? What are the solutions? We've got platforms like Auto, we've got platforms like ourselves, we've got platforms. Gift of the Givers is to fix a disaster once because people have died, have been washed away, their house is gone and all that. They're right at the end of it. They're not in the preventative mode. We're talking infrastructure, we're talking social engineering, we're talking getting a lot of business is not willing to engage with, we've seen in the water sector, with government, doesn't even want to do projects with government because they don't believe they will get paid and, all that. But a lot do business with government. It is possible. So what do we, and to me, I think out of the big metros, so the big ones are really the three in Gauteng, eThekwini and Cape Town. And out of all of them, eThekwini is the first to fail. Okay, and the failure is quite catastrophic. And all the riots and floods did was help push it over. It was pushed over. It was down on its knees. It just pushed it over. What do we do to get this actually going? So as a chamber, what can we do apart from awareness and the likes? But what do we need to do? Because water all of a sudden disappears. The quality all of a sudden goes to zero or starts degrading over periods. Now people don't, you need to slow onset disaster. Electricity is immediate. It's on and off. Electrons are on and off. And we are unable to manage what is the easiest thing in the world to manage, which is energy generation. In actual fact, most of the EU has been over 80 to 90% renewables on the electricity grids. Remember, they use a lot of energy, gas and oil for heating and industrial processes. So their mix is different to ours. It probably equate to 50% of our energy mix. They're managing it. The myth about baseload and all this is all nonsense. It's all people trying to fight to keep their fuel interest going and fossil fuels going and all that. Fossil fuels are here to stay. It's just the mix will decrease. But we are unable to arrest the electron crisis that we have. Now we have a water molecule issue that's in actual fact the death of us because we cannot live more than 2 days without water. 2 days, okay? So the right doesn't take weeks to eat. People will start fighting, killing, maiming, or whatever to get hold of their water within a day. Okay, this is not stuff for for babies. So we can't manage the electrons. What do we need to do to manage the water? And I think we need to look at water and energy together. Do we need a ministry set up by a change in the constitution that gets brought about tomorrow because everybody has marched in front of Parliament? We don't have a Parliament, so let's say the City Hall of Cape Town, which is now the governing seat of our country. I think a lot of people will like that twist in the tail. I think it's quite pathetic. But anyway, everybody marches onto the city of Cape Town in an orderly fashion and demands the constitution get changed. And we have a Ministry of Water and Sanitation with energy. And then what we start doing is with big business, banks, everybody puts their money in their pockets, takes the cash out, puts the terms and conditions, and we start doing things there and then. So is this what it's going to take for us to do? Or are we going to try and stick to the normal protocol of having an Indaba Commission of Inquiry, a Zondo inquiry that's dead already, spending taxpayers' money? What do we need to do in practical terms before Gauteng gets switched off? And I say switched off water and electricity because the two are going to go hand in hand. We've got a stench developing in Ekurhuleni, parts of Ekurhuleni, because the sewers are starting to fill up. Okay, the sewers are starting to fill up. I've got a nose for it, unfortunately, but the sewers are starting to fill up. And our maximum is we get load shed between 4.5, 5 hours pop for 4 hour stint and 2.5 to 3 hours for 2 hour stint. I mean, the guys' watches are not synced to the internet. So you can imagine the guys with all the circuit breakers, they're running around. They actually showed some of them, they don't even have safety gear or anything like this. I can imagine they're getting a bit tired. But what do we do to stop that? Because once the wastewater infrastructure and the water infrastructure fails, and we can't fill it up, because now you start bursting all the pipes with the water hammer and all that, that's tickets. You need water to be able to march to the local government to go and ask for tankers. But they say, well, the tankers, there's no electricity. We couldn't pump fuel from Durban that we import from wherever. What do we do in practical terms? Because to me, everything is so tightly linked, and we saw it with the lockdowns. A whole lot of unintended consequences come in, and all of a sudden, businesses closed. And so we've stocked up on canned food, and you can burn so many candles, and we've stocked up on a few other sort of necessities, and extra batteries, because the batteries just failed. You can't Yeah, they're not meant to run. The very expensive batteries only can run full cycles all the time. But it's actually quite difficult. What does the average person do? What does business do to try and get hope back into the situation? And I think one of the things we need to consider is depoliticizing all of these services, because the political parties are using this and using us as cannon fodder. And you look in the UK, there are 3 prime ministers in 1 year. Did they have any issues with the basic services? No. Yes, they want bigger salaries. In the United States, they had a mini revolution where the guys raided the place. Okay? Trump's still going to go to jail hopefully for that. But what happened? The water worked, the energy worked, the waste worked, and all this. In Brazil, they tried to overthrow the government on Sunday. What happened? The basic services worked. So we need to depoliticize this. And how do we depoliticize our basic services so that we can have water and let's say energy, security? I don't know. Funny, give you a turn there.
Look, you said a lot there, Benoit, and I agree. Firstly, about hope. I think we are critically close to a point where people have lost hope. I speak to many people. I'm a part of a number of different networks. One of them is highly professional, entrepreneurial people, and they are grappling like you cannot believe with this whole idea of hope. I belong to another network of mostly former intelligence officers, senior intelligence officers that are now applying their trade in the risk mitigation business. So they're working as consultants all over the world, in risk management and risk identification, risk mitigation. And we are busy in that group modeling at the moment now what the next risk are. What's going on as a risk roadmap, where you start defining what your thresholds are, your threshold beyond which you start going into a change state or change condition. And what we are finding there is quite remarkable. There are two things that people generally don't appreciate. Number one is that switchgear has got a finite lifespan, and it's defined by the number of times it can be opened or closed, because there's a massive spark that happens each time. You've got tens of thousands of volts jumping across the spark. So your switchgear has got a finite life, and each time you open and shut it like a light switch, you are limiting the life of that equipment. So we're now getting a situation where your high voltage switchgear is failing, and that's what we had here in South Coast this week. One of the high voltage switchgears failed, and then we started getting news coming out of the Eskom terrain that they were trying to put a bypass cable in. Now, a high voltage switchgear, tens of thousands of volts. Now you're going to put a jerry rig, a bypass cable, and guess what happened? The cable blew up as well. So now you've got a switchgear down, and now you've got a cable. I don't know if there were people injured in the process. I don't know that. But nonetheless, this is what is happening. So it's the high voltage switchgear that is now going to start bringing different parts of the grid down, increasingly unreliable. That's in fact we can take. But the second thing that we're starting to see now is it's not what you expect the big risk to be, because the most vulnerable risk is the supply chain, the cold storage supply chain. And once the cold storage supply chain goes in your retail stores and in homes, for example, where I stay now with this 24-hour lockdown or blackout, there were people that were living on solar panels and batteries and what have you. Guess what? They quickly went out and got themselves a Ryobi generator. So Ryobi is doing a great job at the moment here selling generators, but that's what people are living on. Why? Because their refrigerators were defrosting. So these are very, very important things. So we got to depoliticize it. And in fact, I want to just close it by saying that let's not pull our punches. Let us be focused and constructive. But let us never ever forget two important things that I'm going to mention now that we must not forget. The first important thing is that civilization, as we know it, was developed by the Romans when they learned how to bring water into a settlement and take wastewater out. That was the foundation of what we now call civilization, and that's the foundation of civil engineering. That's where civil engineering gets its name from. So if you can't bring water into an area and then take waste out of an area, you are no longer civilized. I mean, that's what it amounts to, and that's the important thing that to take home about that one. Okay. There was something else, but it slipped my mind now.
I think you're talking on the risks. Look, I agree with you with the Romans, and I was actually watching a documentary during load shedding last week, based on the aqueducts and the viaducts and all this. And in actual fact, it's amazing that some of the original tunnels, so they would bring the water with tunnels, okay, through the mountains in Rome, so they were tunneling without the boring machines we have now. So they obviously used colonized individuals, okay, and they colonized neighboring towns, okay. Rome was a town, not a country, and they dug for several years, and they moved water around, yes, and getting the sewage out. And this is why we went into the Dark Ages. We stopped doing that.
Okay, yeah.
We started living in our fecal matter. We don't want to go, and this got nothing to do with colonization, as you say, it's to do with civilization. And we have to take the sewage out.
The second point. I remember my second point. My second point was that, please, and this is a very important take-home message, the USSR imploded in 1989, 1990. It fell apart at the seams. What was the core driver of that failure? Catastrophic failure of one of the world's superpowers. Catastrophic failure because of the inability of the Russian government to constantly bail out state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises that had become so bloated and so overstaffed and so unproductive that the cost to the fiscus eventually destroyed the USSR. Let us not forget that. And then you've just made me think about a third thing now. You talk about those tunnels. In the Middle East, originally in Persia, in the Chaldees area, there's a thing called a khanat, which is an underground tunnel that's dug in the desert, and that's dug very, very accurately over vast distances, following the water table. So it was actually the Persians that originally developed that, but it's become very, very important part of all of your Islamic world's water resource management. So all of the Arab world's water resource management is still based on the Khanat system, and that's based on tunneling underground to take water out of wadis into civilized. So those are the things. So just to put my finger on the pulse again, the USSR collapsed because of its inability to sustain SOEs. Why should South Africa, little Mickey Mouse South Africa, that's a fraction of the size, why should we be any different? And secondly, civilization, the foundation of civilization is getting water in and sewage out. And as you correctly said, when that collapsed, when the Vandals sacked Rome, okay, when the barbarians sacked Rome, we entered the Dark Ages. We entered that Dark Age period where people were dying of choleric diseases and other preventable diseases simply because of the nasty stuff they were drinking. The London School of Tropical Hygiene came out of that as a result, and they were the ones that first identified, guess what, there's cholera in the water, and if you clean your water up, then your life expectancy is significantly better. So these are all, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. And while there's this emotional thing about decolonization, remember decolonization was the Dark Ages. Is that what we really want? Is that actually what we want to aspire to? Because if we want to aspire to that, well, then I'm afraid, as Fred said earlier on, business is already voting with its feet. Capital is liquid and capital's flowing, and it's not flowing into KZN, it's not flowing into South Africa, it's flowing elsewhere. So if capital is evil, well, then we better understand this evil thing. We're not going to print our own because that's not going to work. So we've got to understand that, But basically, that's what it comes down to. Civilization, the very foundation of civilization, is at stake here now. And I'd also like to just tie into with what I said at the beginning of this session today, and that is about the rule of law. Does the law actually matter anymore when it is being so unevenly applied? Are we still a state where the rule of law matters? And if the answer is no, then we cannot expect economic activity to grow. We cannot expect investment to grow because the commercial sector, the private sector relies on law. They have to have law. Investors need law, and you've got to have justiciable rights. If you haven't got a right to a piece of property, or a right to a supply of water, or a right to some energy, etc., if you haven't got those very fundamental rights, then you don't have a business, my friend. Then put your money into Tajikistan or some other part of the world, because you'll get a better return on investment there.
Thanks, Tony. In closing, from your side, Fred?
Yeah, I think for me, two key areas. The one is the need to depoliticize water, because water and energy is required to turn this economy around, regardless of who you are and regardless of when. So for me, there needs to be a safe passage of bills while the political parties are fighting each other. The issues of water and energy have got to have a depoliticized environment in which we can come up with something, because without that, there is no sustainable future. The second thing is, I think we've spoken about the need for an engaged citizenry and the need for a engaged business sector. And I would just call on the business sector to come in behind the water chamber and support it, because at the end of the day, we need a united front in engaging with these issues. We need to increase the decibels, and we need to increase the influence. And we know if business puts its weight collectively behind it, we can start making a difference. So I would call on business to collectively come behind the water chamber, and let's drive the change that we would like to see.
Thanks, Fred and Tony. I agree. To get hope back in. Look, we know civilization and technology abound. We've been doing this for 2,000 years and evolving as we go. That's not the issue. It's available. It's a human issue. It's a social issue. It's a political issue. And I think you're very key. And maybe this is a narrative that needs to be driven a lot harder generally across our basic services. We need to depoliticize the civil service so that services and the likes, so from home affairs through collecting your waste and delivering water and energy, can be depoliticized so that can carry on irrespective of whoever is ruling the place. That's how democracy, a functional democracy, actually works. So I think the bottom line message I'm getting through today is there is hope. We need to depoliticize our civil service and get all stakeholders involved, active citizenry and active business. And remember, government represents us, okay? So we are the problem, and government is made up of us, so it's not an abject thing. So it's an actual fact in our control. And I think sometimes we need this type of crisis to, in actual fact, wake us up to the facts as to how low we've actually stooped. And think of the 30 million who do not have jobs or dignified jobs, who rely on grants and all the like. It's half our population who are reliant on the few of us left here who are able to pay taxes and our businesses and our levies and customs duties and the like to try and keep the system going. But that is stretching it. It's as stretched as our water and energy infrastructure. I thank you for your input today, and let's try and see what we can do through social media from a constructive perspective, as we normally do. We look forward to more comments from folk on the various platforms during the course of the next week or two. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. And please suggest to us what you would like us to do apart from what we have discussed today. We will definitely, from a water chamber, try and get more support out of the business sector, who has disengaged itself largely. We'll try and get more support. What else would you like us to do? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brigitte?
Yeah.